Many people know of a tree called Yggdrasil. Some call it tree of life, some people call it tree of knowledge. In many different, what can you say, cultures, there is this belief of the tree that connects heaven, if you like, heaven, the cosmology, the cosmos, to the earth. In some different belief systems, different cultures, they have at the bottom of the root system weaving the fates, the three fates, and they are weaving the life of the different humans. That's what they're doing, that's their job. So this story, if you like, is about the time before Yggdrasil, or more appropriately, how the tree became Yggdrasil. So in a way, it's like a creation story. For many cultures, Yggdrasil was always there, like God always has been there. But for my people, perhaps you would like to say, it was not always there. It was something that was created. So therefore, it's like a creationary story. Before it was called Yggdrasil, and known as the tree of life or the tree of knowledge, we called it the Lament Tree. But we said it quick, Lament Tree. Lament Tree. But it was the Lament Tree. The word lament, other word tree. And it was not one tree. One tree was the Lament Tree. In what we mean by that is that it wasn't one tree for the whole world. There were lament trees for everybody, everywhere. The lament tree was utilized by humans because humans were very aware that something made them animate, if you like, that made them different from their neighbor, their wife, their husband, etc. They were very aware of that. But so they assumed, like many of us do now, that there was, we use the word spirit now, that there was something that was within them that made them this way. As an extension of that, they assumed that anything that was in the world, therefore, had to have a spirit. Because even if you had this oak tree and this oak tree, the same kind of oak tree, they would not grow in the same way. They would have branches in different places. So they assumed, like humans, that there was spirit in that. They were also aware that the tree, for example, was a very solid, strong, yes, perhaps wise is a good word, that was in a way more than them, because many trees, the trees that they used for their lament trees were old. They were big, old trees. So for a human, they were aware that this being had been here for much longer than they had, and therefore it had acquired a certain majesty about it. So a lament tree was always the tree in the forest or the wood or the bush around them that was the one that exuded the most majesty. It gave off the most, that kind of strong energy. And of course they imagined that there was a spirit in that tree that made it what it was. So for many groups, they would have in their the closest surrounding forest or wooded area, they would have one tree that they called the Lament Tree. The Lament Tree was utilized for humans to go to and discuss, if you like, their worries. Perhaps they couldn't get with child. Perhaps they were not good hunters. Perhaps the chief was unable to control people. Perhaps there was an unruly child. All of these types of things. The same sorts of issues that are today always also there. So they would go to the Lament Tree. They would put their right hand on the tree, and often their forehead here on the tree, so they could connect like that. And they would pour out to the Lament Tree all of the things that were troubling them, all of the things that were a burden to them, and they would give it to that tree. They would share it. They wouldn't give it, really, they would share it with that tree. Because very often, and you'll find this in your own life, when you have a burden that you keep to yourself, it can be detrimental to the self. If you can just share even some of that burden by just telling somebody, and somebody can help you, be compassionate with you, commiserate with you, give you some advice, then that burden often becomes less than, and you can see more clearly. So there's a saying, a burden shared, right? It's the same thing with the tree, with the Lament Tree. There would be this sharing of the burden. So when the person had done this, they felt that they still had the problem, they still had the burden, but there was a lightness of it, a lightness about it, and perhaps they could cope better. The interesting thing, however, is that what they then found throughout time was that they would go to the Lament Tree and they would share their burden, and then they would go back to their life. Maybe things changed, maybe they didn't. But often then, later, they would go back, into the wood to gather, to hunt, to walk, to do whatever. And they would just be walking, maybe not even thinking about that issue or that burden that they went to the Lament Tree about. And they would touch another tree, maybe they would brush past something, they would pick some fruit, whatever it was. And often they would, as if it was like a lightning bolt in their head, they would get an answer, or they would get clarity, or they would have this feeling of understanding and of the issue that they went to the Lament Tree about. They might even have forgotten about that issue with the Lament Tree. But all of a sudden it came back, and it was not just clear for them, not just an unburdening, but it was knowledge. They were given some knowledge that could assist them. So as time went on and generations, humans were always quick thinkers, but sometimes these things take time. They realized that the trees were talking to each other. They were talking to each other. So somebody would go to the Lament Tree, who was the majesty of that wood, forest, bush, and then that information, that burden, was then disseminated to the other trees. And somewhere along the line it was disseminated so much that clarity came, and there was an ability for the tree to understand and to give an answer or to give advice. Not the Lament Tree, but the others that were around it. And for some groups, initially this was thought that it was like a magic, that forest or that wood was enchanted. It was an enchanted area, right? And that it was, perhaps there were elementals in there taking the information from one tree to another and passing it on. Absolutely possible. Absolutely possible. They also discovered, when people realized the benefit of this, they were able to take their fear away and to go and look and see what was going on here in this place. And some bright spark noticed that around the trees, the Lament Tree, were mushrooms, but called fungi. Different kinds, not all the same, but they were around the tree. And then they started to think, they looked at that and thought that was odd, and then they, by chance, if you like, the bright spark, then went to the tree to try and see, the tree that had given them the answer, the knowledge, to look at that tree to see what there was. And they noticed as well, there around the tree was this fungi. Not all the same, but it was there. And then they thought, this is a very interesting discovery. So then they started to look at all the different trees that had spoken. And they noticed that there was this fungi. They noticed that there were paths of fungi all through this wooded area. And so they got a shaman who was a diviner, because all shamans, not all, many shamans have a particular skill. This one was a diviner. Maybe you call it a seer. Yes, seer. To come and to look at this space. And what this shaman discovered was that if you were up in the tree and you looked down, and it was like you could see through the top layer of the ground, you would see that it was like connections that were like lighting up. All these different colors lighting up. And they realized that the fungi was like a conduit. Right? It was a conduit through the forest. It was like the mail service. That, of course, they didn't have mail service. Was the messenger service through the forest. And they realized that that was something that was unique to the natural world, right?
Yep.
Before they would just walk through the forest and step on they were not so careful. They would just pick the fungi, they would step on it. It wouldn't mean anything to them. But they realized that this was something, the power of that there was all of these connections just under the surface, if you like. And it was going from this tree to that tree to this plant all around. And it was the fungi that was being the communicator. What did this mean? In practical terms, in, if you like, spiritual terms, there was that feeling of getting an answer, relieving your burden and then getting an answer to your burden. But in practical, when they started to look at what messages could be sent, it was very interesting what they found. Because what they found was that the forest, we're just going to use the word forest, but you can imagine wood, mountainous area, wherever there was, that it was providing what the people needed. Because when they came to the Lament Tree, we don't have enough food, we don't have this and that, we don't have enough water. The forest was sending through the fungi, the tree was disseminating this information through the fungi to the other trees and to all of the plants around. And the forest was able to provide what was required for the humans. So they realized that there was a lot more going on in this natural world, in this forest, than they ever imagined. It wasn't something that was just a tree that grew up and it was its own entity. Yes, it was, but in this area it was a living, dynamic organism. And they realized the importance of that, right? And that they had this living, dynamic organism there that was helping them. that was teaching them, that was giving them what they needed. So this was a revelation to them, and it actually changed the way people looked at the natural world. They didn't just look at it and say, this is where we get our food from, this is where we hunt our animals, etc. This is where we get the materials to make shelters and what have you. They looked at it as something that was actually alive, dynamic, with a mind, right? And so that changed the way that people looked and interacted with the natural world. As a result of that, Yggdrasil was born, because they realized that the tree of majesty, the Lament Tree, was much more than just something to put your burdens to, something to share with. It was the fount of knowledge, because when you think about it, the humans were putting all of their or some of their knowledge into that Lament Tree. As a result of that, that tree was disseminating that information through the fungi all around it. And so that tree became the tree of knowledge, but also the tree of life, because it was giving that information so that the forest, for example, could provide what the humans really needed. Yggdrasil. That's how, for us, we have Yggdrasil.